Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 296 of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. Today, I visit with my good friend and colleague, Michael Volkov, about two recent blockbuster FCPA enforcement actions. The first involves the Brazilian construction giant Odebrecht and its subsidiary Braskem. The second involves the Israeli pharmaceutical company Teva Pharmaceutical. The episode is about 30 minutes. I think you will find it a fascinating deep dive into these two enforcement actions. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. Mike, I wanted to see if we could take a bit of a deep dive into two of the year-end's most stunning FCPA enforcement actions. We had Odebrecht, Braskem out of Brazil, and then Teva Pharmaceutical, which is a Israeli domiciled company, but also has operations here in the United States. They were just rather stunning in both the breadth and scope of the bribery schemes that they had going on, and as a result, the fines, of course, were equally stunning. Odebrecht coming in at the number one in the all-time global anti-corruption enforcement fine range of between $4.5 billion to $2.6 billion, with $424 million paid to the U.S. Treasury, and then we had Teva coming in at $519 million. But I wanted to maybe start with Odebrecht and just get sort of your initial impressions on the schemes, the scope, the jurisdiction, and what it might mean for global anti-corruption enforcement going forward.
Well, I think, it's a stunning prosecution in a number of ways. First is the coordination, and I've always said, by the way, that we have a great MLAT treaty and a great relationship, U.S. law enforcement in Brazil, I know from experience. And that was evidenced by this settlement, but also the Swiss prosecutors were part of the settlement. So we have three: Brazil, Switzerland, and the U.S. I think there was some indication, and I can't remember exactly how I got this information, to be honest with you, but that and I may have read it in another, report or whatever, but that the companies involved basically saw the U.S. as a way to facilitate a global settlement. And that may be because there may have been certain difficulties, or it wasn't so clear that whatever would happen in Brazil would necessarily be respected by the U.S. or the Swiss governments in terms of resolving the prosecutions. What this said to me is that the U.S. is willing to be a broker, in a sense. In other words, to bring people to the table and try to resolve jointly a international, bribery or corruption prosecution. And I think that actually is a good development, because I think on the one hand, it brings, sort of one-stop shopping for companies in this problem. I mean, we've had situations where a company for its same course of conduct would have to resolve the case with 5 different entities, sovereigns, countries. And I think here what was well done by the U.S. was orchestrating this, bringing people together and getting people to sign off on it in terms of the Brazilians and the Swiss. And what's even more stunning to me is that, Brazil is where most of this conduct occurred, or most of their liability lies, since Odebrecht and Braskem are both, Brazilian-based companies. Obviously, they have global operations, but to me, who would be the logical prosecutor on this case? And yet it was the U.S., I think, taking sort of the driver's seat in resolving this. So I think that raises a whole host of issues and risks when you start to consider this. So now, for example, let's say in the future, and just to take an example, the Swiss or the Brazilians discover, a bribery scheme with a few incidents in their country. And all of a sudden, because of their well-established relationship with the U.S., they can pass that information to the U.S. And now the U.S. launches, let's say, a larger bribery investigation. It means that the risks of detection and follow-up have gone up significantly for companies. And I hate to, sound like a scaremonger or anything like that, but it means that we can be exposed, or a company can be detected anywhere in the globe now that could have implications back to the United States if they're a U.S. company or subject to the FCPA.
So let me pick up on a couple of those points because I think it was very interesting. And let me just preface it with, in the ACI National FCPA Conference held in Washington in late November, early December of this year, Kara Brockmeyer and Dan Kahn both talked about the international cooperation, not only in investigations, which you highlighted, Mike, but also in the enforcement/prosecution. And the way Kara described it was there was one pie to split, and they would have to work to, as she called it, equitably distribute the proceeds of the pie being the enforcement fines and penalties. And what struck me about the Odebrecht case in that context was I really feel like the U.S. Department of Justice and SEC really may be the only national enforcement agencies that have the credibility, if not the cachet, to put together this type of settlement, because the U.S. has led the world in anti-corruption enforcement. I think that's given credibility to those two agencies, coupled with both the SEC and Department of Justice have worked very hard, not only on the mutual assistance treaty angle, which you mentioned, but also to train prosecutors to investigate and enforce domestic anti-corruption laws across the globe. There are training sessions, sort of week-long boot camps that the DOJ and SEC have put on multiple times, where they've trained prosecutors in both investigative techniques and enforcement techniques. And I think they've built a very good relationship with many of their brethren across the globe. And really the Odebrecht case, to me, is the first public result of some very, very interesting seeds that were sown by the U.S. enforcement authorities. The benefits reaped in Odebrecht seem to bear that out.
Well, and it may be that they made that statement, for example, at the ACI, knowing full well that within the next month or so, this was going to come out, and this case was going to be settled. Apparently, this case was settled in like record time. In terms of the internal investigation, the presentation to the Justice Department and the SEC, and the coordination, apparently, was done within 2 years or a year and a half, is what I heard, which is really very, very quick for such an investigation. But I think, they had found a lot of the conduct before in response to the Brazilians' initial prosecution, or investigation. So I think what I think is, Kara Brockmeyer and Dan Kahn wanted to emphasize this point. And, they always have some new theme at each one of these conferences. And the theme of the sort of globalization and their cooperation is a big deal. I think that this can, I sort of watch their relationships with other law enforcement agencies and other sovereigns. And you see, going back to SBM offshore, where they deferred completely to, I think it was the Danish or Netherlands, in that resolution. So, I mean, we've seen this coming for a while, but I think it's maturing. And, I remember you'll go in for meetings at DOJ, for example, with the FCPA people, and they'll tell you their travel plans or whatever. I won't be here next week or whatever. And a lot of times they do a lot of sort of, meetings at international forums, and they work at this. I think it's, not just prosecuting cases, but they work at these relationships because they know they're important to the fight against corruption. I mean, it's critical. Going back to I want to make a couple comments also on the case itself, in that, it truly reads like the facts, you have to admit, are pretty blatant and even in some respects more sophisticated or more ingrained in the corporation structure by having a separate, division engaged in, or separate entity engaged, in bribery. It is a little, to me, I read it and I thought, what, this is even worse than the institutionalization of bribery at Siemens. It just, and the other thing that just struck me about that is, here we are in the middle of a global crackdown, a global fight against corruption. And here's a company that side by side with that risk is just engaging in a flagrant, bribery operation. And it was just a part of their business operation. And, nobody was questioning anything. They were just, they just kept going. And it just struck me as, this is like a fact pattern that I may have expected 10 years ago, but I certainly didn't expect it to keep going as long as this did. In Brazil, and also I've been involved in, cartel cases in Brazil, and I know that they're pretty blatant there too. But, this had cartel aspects to it as well with Braskem. But it just was, the facts were really just, overwhelming in some respects, and the number of countries involved.
Well, I certainly agree with that, Mike. I had worked in a company, or my last corporate position, we had a Brazilian subsidiary, and at one point we thought we were paying bribes, so they sent me down to do an investigation along with a forensic accountant. And in really the first morning of the first day, it became clear we weren't paying bribes, that we were being extorted by a subcontractor who was on the approved subcontractor list for Petrobras. And that's when it really struck me, the institutional corruption that was involved with Petrobras, and that the subcontractor we were directed to use was extorting money out of us by forcing us to make payments for employees who did not show up, phantom employees, and then probably, although it was not known to me at the time, they were kicking back some of that to the Petrobras purchasing people who put them on the approved supplier list. So we had really a level of institutional corruption through Petrobras that seeped down to multiple levels. Odebrecht was a direct contractor to Petrobras, and the thing that I wanted to highlight was, or really two things. One is the Brazilian prosecutors made clear they did not want to put Odebrecht and Braskem out of business. One of the reasons that the companies were still critical to the economies of Brazil, but also they wanted to have access to the information that Odebrecht had on bribe schemes really across the globe that they were involved in. The second thing, though, is if you are a U.S. company or really any company that has done business with not only Odebrecht and Braskem, but any of their contractors or any of their subcontractors, you've got to take a look at your own dealings now. Odebrecht is one of North America's largest contractors. I mean, Bechtel may be larger than Odebrecht, but Odebrecht does business in Houston, Texas. They have a USA subsidiary, and that means if you're doing business with Odebrecht in the United States, you better get out there and see if you've got anything that you need to clean up. Because the levels of corruption were so endemic to the corporation that they may have seeped to levels and relationships previously we hadn't thought about before. So I really.
But that tells you that the consequences of this global scheme, in other words, particularly when you tie it to the contractors like that, and to Petrobras, means that there are probably a lot of companies out there that have to do some cleanup. And I'm not saying they have to report it, but they have to clean up activities related to Odebrecht. They may be, they may have been involved in situations where people have their head in the sand and payments that they were making were in fact being used to fund certain bribery payments and, to government officials. And I find that troubling, to say the least. The other thing is that this case had the same old usual, stupid activity by criminals who try to cover up their crimes once they get caught. And usually for a prosecutor, that's like the best evidence you can get, when you get the obstruction of justice and all that. I mean, I always say, Tom, every internal investigation, somebody tries to destroy documents that they think are harmful, and they think they can destroy them and nobody will see them again. But in fact, what they do is help you. They point you to where the evidence is, because
Right.
They try to destroy things on the server. And, emails you can't really destroy unless you get access to the server. So, it's like this case had everything that we've seen in terms of, some of the more egregious schemes that we've seen through the years, all in one case, all connected. And you're right to point out how much of this emanates from Petrobras, as a government, state-owned entity. And the level of corruption in Brazil is just so high these days, even, at the executive and congressional level there. So, this case certainly stands out. I know that some commentators talked about how this really isn't that big a blockbuster because the U.S. is only getting $424 million, and the bulk of the money is going to Brazil. But to me, it still stands as a pretty significant corruption enforcement case. And I think it'll stay in history as, one of the top 10 for a long time in its scope and in the operation. I mean, it touched, I think it was close to 13 or 14 separate countries. We're used to settlements involving 3 countries or 5 countries, but this was like 14 or so. Right.
So now, Mike, let's turn to Teva Pharmaceutical, because that had some really interesting aspects as well. That was announced, I think, 2 days after Odebrecht. So the fine and penalty was $519 million, and of that, 236 was profit disgorgement, and then 284, I believe, went to the Department of Justice, 283 to the Department of Justice, I should say. There's a 3-year DPA signed by Teva requiring a independent compliance monitor. We should also note that Odebrecht is having a monitor as well. But what are some of your initial impressions, or at least anything that really jumped out at you from Teva, other than just the $519 million settlement?
But the $519 million has to be put in context to, we've always heard about the pharma and medical device sweep, you know what I'm saying? And here we have yet another, pharma company that's caught up in this. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but it seems to me like the largest pharma medical device settlement up till, before Teva was Johnson & Johnson, I think, and it was like $70 million. Now, it was several years ago. But this, in terms of scope and in terms of punishment and an independent corporate monitorship for at least 3 years, is mind-boggling in some respects. And this is no fly-by-night outfit, as you know. I mean, these guys are pretty mature company, very successful, very aggressive in the competitive marketplace. And look what happens. So I find it pretty amazing that we're sitting here, talking about a $520 million settlement against a pharma company. I mean, I don't think we're going to get close to that number. I know there's some other pharma companies still under investigation, but I just don't think we're going to come into a situation where it's this pervasive or this significant. Now, looking at the facts themselves and the country, I mean, it's, for example, in the Russian Ministry of Health, we had, payments that were made, and I guess all of this related to one drug, and I don't know how you say it, but Copaxone, right?
Right.
And, they're basically cutting in government officials into the profits with inflated profit margins. And you had like a government owned business, basically a government official owned a business and was providing repackaging and distribution services, but basically they didn't need them. And they would get they basically made $65 million in corrupt profits went to the Russian company owned by the Russian official. I mean, it was pretty blatant in that sense, but it shows you that sometimes you get people money through, equitable interest. Sometimes they just pay it otherwise. I guess they thought they were hiding something by, using this company, which in turn was owned by the Russian official. And then some of the other things these are pretty standard things that at least we've seen in the drug industry. Like in the Ukrainian case, they bribed the Minister of Health, for getting their drug registered and all that stuff, to meet the registration requirements for products. And then they have the standard Mexican operation where they're paying bribes to doctors who were employed by the Mexican government for, increased prescriptions. So, I mean, it just is pretty amazing. We have another, DPA, we have another compliance monitor, which I think, by the way, is one of the big stories of the year, is the return of the compliance monitor. In these two cases are pretty egregious cases, and DOJ had no problem imposing, 3-year monitorships on these two companies. So I guess it's pretty shocking again to see sort of the level of corruption, but I guess we shouldn't be so surprised. But again, Teva's no small company; they have plenty of resources, and apparently senior executives were aware of this, and they didn't. They had supposedly a compliance program on paper, but they just basically ignored it in terms of complying with certain requirements and all that.
So there were three things that I wanted to highlight, Mike. The first one was the amount of money. Well, in the bribery schemes in Russia, I should probably start there because they had multiple bribery schemes. The first bribery scheme from sort of 02, 03, 04 timeframe up to 2010 was they had a distributor paying the bribes. But
right.
In 2010, the government made the decision that they wanted for their healthcare policy to centralize certain drugs, or rather centralized treatments for certain very severe medical conditions, multiple sclerosis being one. The drug prescribed by or developed by Teva addressed or helped address that issue. And so they changed how the payment scheme would be made, and the Russian minister in charge of that health initiative, who could control whether or not Teva's drug was going to be purchased, supplanted the distributor. So we had the old distributor go away. They set up a new distributorship with the wife of the Russian minister official as the owner, and then as you said, splitting the profits. He made in 1 year or 2 years $65 million. Well, Teva made over $100 million in profits, as reported in the criminal information. So the amount of money Teva made was huge, but with multiple bribery schemes over multiple years. So I think that was one of the reasons the fine and penalty was so large. But then if I could flip over to Mexico, because in Mexico they had, their bribery scheme was as old-fashioned as it could get. It was cash paid to doctors, and it was cash paid directly from Teva. And at some point, someone in the corporate compliance office said, we can't do this anymore. And so the Mexican officials then actually directed the Mexican distributor network to make the payments and told the doctors that the payments would be forthcoming from the distributors rather than Teva directly. And these were open communications via email and other sources that were reported in the information. But the thing that struck me there the most, Mike, was that the cash paid to doctors was as low as $3,000. So you had what you and I might think were very low bribes paid, although they added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars over multiple years for securing huge profits. And then there was a final point that I have not seen in any FCPA enforcement action, and it came up in the Teva case, and it came up in the Russian bribery scheme. And, you know, I mentioned that there was a distributor who was supplanted when they started the new relationship. Well, Teva had risk insurance around the receivables because when you have a distributor relationship, you can either sell the product to the distributor and the distributor can then resell above what he's paid, or you can ship it and then payment is made contingent upon the distributor making a resale and then remitting back part of the proceeds. And there's apparently it was that second model which was used because Teva had risk insurance for this initial Russian distributor. That's fairly common financial risk insurance. Well, the risk insurer, who was not named in the criminal information, stopped insuring the payments with the Russian company because of the risk of bribery and corruption was so high. So here you had a true third party, an independent insurance company of some note, who had a standard insurance product, but because the risk was so high with the Russian distributor, they ceased doing business, or at least writing that coverage. And I've not seen that in any other enforcement action where an insurance company raised a red flag for the company. And so I found that
and
very
we talked about, I think that's fascinating because it shows you, again, sort of all the people around you that can raise this issue. And, you know, I always expect more audit firms to raise these issues. And I think there's only one case, I think, that you and I discussed where there was an audit firm that actually reported a company to the government. But here you have, that's a great point about the risk insurance. I also think it's amazing that, you know, here these guys just gave the Russian government official an equity interest. They knew that this person had an equity interest, and the profits they would make was in accordance with that equitable interest. And the only other case that reminded me of was the Hitachi case, where the government officials, again, you know, bought an equitable interest in an entity that was ultimately used as a way to funnel bribes. And so to me, once you engage in these equitable type interests where there's ownership interest, you make a good point. Then, like an insurance company will see an ownership relationship. And then that's probably what triggered this, at least on the risk insurance basis. Hey, why is this government official in this chain of ownership here?
Right.
At least if they're doing their job. And that makes it easier for a third party like a risk insurance company to say, hey, this doesn't smell right. You know, a very similar thing happened, for example, in the joint venture in Akzif, where you had surrounding, you had people related to the transactions that were raising issues, and that comes up as well. And here, I guess this is really the first time that I've seen an insurance company. You have banks who raise the issue or people who are doing certain transactions at times, but here to have an insurance company raising that is pretty amazing. I mean, they're pretty conservative usually in that sense.
So
one last issue I wanted to raise was what was interesting though about the Mexican set of facts was that they sort of crafted the charges based on a internal accounting controls failure and not around bribes, per se. And I wonder, I don't know if you've had any thoughts about why the government used the system of internal accounting controls and not just said, hey, you guys engaged in bribery. Because I thought they had adequate evidence of bribery. Going back to what you were saying, where they were paying cash, but maybe it was after the cash stopped that they had a harder time proving it.
No, that's a good point, and it was really driven home to me because in the SEC complaint, it really fleshed out the Mexican bribery scheme in a way that was not laid out in the criminal information, and which explains why there was really no criminal prosecution around the Mexican bribery scheme, yet it was a part of the civil component of the enforcement action.
Huh. That's interesting, though. It wasn't in the DOJ paperwork really fleshed out at all as to why, they crafted it that way. So.
Well, Mike, two stunning cases the week before Christmas, and we've got a couple of more days left in the new year, so who knows what it may foretell. But thanks very much, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. This will be my last podcast in 2016. We will start next week with a wrap-up with Mike Volkov of top cases, top issues from 2016, and take a look at some of the things that might come up in 2017. I have two requests for you. The first one is, if you are listening to this podcast on iTunes, if you would rate our podcast, it would help with the rankings. The second thing is, if you have some questions you'd like answered, I'm developing a mailbag episode, so email them to me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. If you're listening to this podcast before December 31st, I hope you have a very happy and safe and joyous New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And if you're listening to this in the New Year's, I welcome you into 2017, and hopefully your 2017 will be better than your 2016. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening.